and welcome to #Africa. I'm Andrea van Wyk. Let's start off with the day's top stories on the continent. The African Union is giving Sudan's military 15 days to transfer power to civilians or face suspension from the Pan-African body. The ultimatum follows demonstrations against the Transitional Military Council that took the reins following the ousting of President Omar al-Bashir, who ruled for 3 decades. Members of the Military Council say they're in the process of choosing a prime minister for a civilian government. Members of the Algerian judiciary have announced plans to boycott the country's presidential elections taking place on the 4th of July. This is in solidarity with the people of Algeria following the removal of President Abdelaziz Bouteflika after 20 years in power. Protesters are now demanding that Bouteflika's generals, businessmen and ruling party politicians also relinquish power. Government and aid agencies are in a race against time in cyclone-hit Mozambique as looming famine and logistical challenges are threatening to turn the situation from bad to worse. According to the United Nations, food has been distributed from day one. So far, it's reached 1 million people and more than 100,000 people are receiving emergency shelter. But still, the aid is a race against time, as not everyone in the affected areas has received humanitarian assistance due to lack of access. Let's now get to the latest developments from Sudan. After 30 years in power, Omar al-Bashir has been ousted as president. But the future leadership of this nation in the Horn of Africa is uncertain. The interim military leader, who was appointed after the defense minister resigned from that position, has promised protesters they'll soon have a civilian government. But it could take longer than is hoped.
Leader number 3 for Sudan in as many days, yet another army commander, promising victorious and jubilant protesters that there will be a civilian government to follow 3 decades of autocratic rule under Omar al-Bashir. Still, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan Abdel Rahman says the transition could take up to 2 years. And the crowds on Khartoum's streets are impatient for change and an end to rule by men in fatigues. Al-Bashir was arrested on Thursday after 4 months of protests over rising food prices, high unemployment and growing repression. Defence Minister Awad ibn Auf took over as interim leader, but stepped down after just 1 day. Burhan was sworn in on Saturday. He was the military's number 3, but is believed to be more ready to talk to the demonstrators. And protests claimed another high-profile scalp Saturday, Sudan's powerful intelligence chief Salah Ghosh. Buoyed by success, protesters ignored an overnight curfew Ibn Auf attempted to impose. Burhan has now cancelled those curfews and promised to release political prisoners. As this grainy footage shows, some soldiers even joined the jubilant masses over the last couple of days. Ongoing demonstrations surged a week ago, inspired by events in Algeria, where another ageing autocrat quit after 2 decades in office, following weeks of similar demonstrations. Sudan's protests have met violence. At least 16 people were killed by what police said was stray bullets at protests and sit-ins on Thursday and Friday. 75-year-old Bashir seized power in a coup in 1989. One question for Sudan will be whether to hand him over to a UN tribunal over his alleged role in atrocities in the Darfur conflict from 2003. The military council so far says it won't extradite Bashir, indicted almost 15 years ago by the International Criminal Court in The Hague.
There is a battle for Africa's large automotive market. Global auto giants are sniffing around. While the African market is dominated by second-hand cars, it promises rapid growth as trade tensions threaten sales elsewhere in the world.
For many Africans, their first car will be a second-hand one. But could that be about to change? Used vehicles, like here on the outskirts of Nairobi, are cheap and plentiful, sent over at virtually scrap prices from Japan and the Middle East, which have strict rules on which cars are roadworthy. 1 billion people live in Africa, but they account for just 1% of the world's new car sales. And almost all of those are in South Africa. So it's a potentially lucrative market, and one car giants are hoping to exploit.
We started scanning the markets And we looked into ways of opening them up, because they're literally not functioning right now due to importation of used vehicles all the way from Japan or the US. It's a dumping ground for used cars.
Major car makers have now joined together to lobby African governments to limit car imports and allow them to start local production. VW has set up operations in Nigeria, Kenya and here in Rwanda. Nissan in South Africa, and it's starting to have an effect. Reuters can reveal that manufacturers are set to get 10-year tax breaks if they set up in Nigeria, Kenya and Ghana. Companies like VW believe there's a potential market for 3 to 4 million new cars in Africa, 10 times the current amount. But that will mean turning interest away from the more affordable second-hand market.
First of all, I lose my source of revenue, because I normally feed my family, I educate my children using the proceeds I get from the car business.
Incomes are rising across Africa, and car makers are looking to expand into a new market due to global trade tensions and bans on emissions in Europe and elsewhere.
Still ahead on #Africa, African and European farmers march to the European Union over milk dumping. And later, locals weigh in on why a certain town in Nigeria has the highest twin birth rates. Stay with us.